broadcasting.
Okay, welcome everyone to the celebration of OAT 20 years and this third in a series of 4 in conversations with. Today we have the curators from the earlier editions with us, and they will join us for a conversation on the history of the Triennale, but also on thinking together about the future of the Triennale. As a part of the 20 years jubileum, we entered into collaboration with Architecture N, which is a Norwegian architecture magazine, on producing an essay series that reflected back on previous editions of the Triennale. So together with Architecture N, we invited all the curators and initiators of the earlier editions to kind of reflect back on what they did in their work with OAT, and also think about what the relevance of that is both today but also in the future. And we're very happy to have everyone here today, and I will do a short round of introductions to start with, so everybody that's at home looking at this knows who is who and when and where they worked with the Triennale. I will also start with myself. My name is Hanna Densik Petersson, and I'm the director of the Triennale. And now I'll ask Reiulf to say hello. Reiulf, this is Reiulf Ramstad. He is the mind kind of behind the first edition of the Triennale. He was on the board in NAL and worked intensively to create an Oslo Triennale, and managed to do so and produce the first edition in 2000. And then there's Gudmund Stokke. Hi, Gudmund.
Hello.
Hi, who was president in NAL when they arranged the second edition of the Triennale in 2003. So he had a very instrumental role in making that happen. And then we have Gary Bates. Hi. He was the first appointed curator in OAT, and worked with the Triennale in 2007. And then we have Bjarne Ringstad. Hey, Bjarne. Who was also appointed curator and worked with the Triennale in 2010, just man-made. I should have introduced all the all the titles, but we'll do that afterwards. And then in 2013 we had Rotor, who curated and was appointed through the first international open call for curators. They unfortunately couldn't join us today. And then in 2016, we had a team called After Belonging, and Alejandra Navarrete Lopez is representing the team today. Hi. Hello. And then last but not least, Cecilie Stax-Olsen, who was a part of the team in 2019, the last Triennale. Hello.
Hi.
Okay, so I guess with no further ado, I'll ask, wait, I have to say to everyone at home, so there's both people joining us on Zoom in the meeting, but then there is also people attending through a YouTube live stream. And in both these platforms, you will be able to ask questions both to me if you want me to bring something forward, but also to the panelists, and either to one of them or to everyone as a group. So please just write your questions in the chat, and we will try to incorporate them in the conversation. Okay, perfect. Reiulf, would you like to start?
Yes, please.
Go for it.
Okay, it's of course I'm very happy to be here, and then it's to say I received the architecture prize, and I'm in the middle of this dinner celebrating it. so I have to just say, like, I can attend not more than half an hour, unfortunately. So, and as I understood, you wanted us to give some reflections of the theme.
Yeah, just very short to introduce the essay you wrote, and yeah.
Yes, actually the essay is very linked up to the idea why we needed a triennial in Oslo, and of course it's also something that is very important because architecture needs to be discussed on different arenas. And I felt very much that at the time, was 20 years ago, I was slightly younger and I just started my office, and it was very hard to get projects. The former generation were very clever to get or to manage to get really good projects. And I came back I was actually born in Oslo, and I came back to Oslo after living abroad like 12 years. And I didn't know anyone at the time within the profession. So I actually started to work really, really from the bottom. And I saw that Oslo at the time was lacking a kind of spirit of the contemporary city. So I kind of tried to discuss basically from the start that architecture actually expresses need and use. And I can see a lot of needs, and especially among my contemporaries. And there was actually very difficult to find meeting places and to understand that a city could be so much more than Oslo was at the time, when I've been living in very vital places, mostly in Italy. And I was I actually lived a lot in Italy, in one town in Venice. And Venice was always a big celebration with the art biennale, with the film festival, with the architecture biennale. So that was my kind of motivation and the idea came up to start something not similar, but something that was actually adapted to Oslo and its conditions. And I think that, you know, architecture, as I said, express needs and use. And so individuals, families, households, interest groups, societies, and they foster many different ways in which human beings live. And I kind of think that the basic idea of a good city is that it should be a space for everyone. So I really believe in urban development must be safeguarded in diversity. That tolerance can only be expressed through a multiplicity in the built environment. And I think that the city, as I saw it 20 years ago, and even now, has to incorporate space for both individual and collective identity. And of course, we can discuss what has happened in those these 20 years. But I think it's very interesting that, and the discussion on the city and how the city should evolve will always be there. And so actually ways of living was chosen in order to express something general and overarching. Just as surroundings is a general term for physical structures in which life takes place and by which it's framed. So ways of living was intended as a term denoting how life is lived, actually. And what I really believe in is that among my friends and the people I know of, I see so many different preferences, how people want to live. And I think the only way we can actually work towards a better urban life, especially in this time here, you can see that the city is not only a functional landscape in terms of living and working, but it also becomes a place where we have our recreation. So the city in a way also becomes very much a recreational landscape. So in brief terms, that was the idea, and I think we have not managed to develop this complete city. We will never do, but we should never give up the humbleness, and that the city, it's not a good city if it's not for everyone, actually. So I think it's also in the market, there's a tendency very much to prefer like very general solutions. I think the general is very often mediocre and very often even bad. So
yeah, great, thank you. And I'm gonna actually have a kind of follow-up question to you, as I won't be able to keep you for the whole conversation. So I think also what's interesting in reading, because a part of your essay is actually an old text that you wrote in before, as a kind of starting piece or kind of a preface to the Triennale in 2000. And when reading that, I think a lot of what you write is many of these issues that you bring up is still relevant, I think, in many ways. But I want to ask you, because you also said it now, that when you came from living abroad, you felt coming back to Oslo was you were looking for a bit more vibrant kind of life and a bigger discourse on architecture and what it could do. And do you find 20 years later that has the Triennale somehow, or has the city in any way kind of managed to actually create a larger debate on architecture, and what kind of, how do you see that 20 years later?
Yeah, of course, it's I don't have one particular answer, but I think that at least the city, how I live in, I was born just in the center of Oslo, and I just live a couple of 100 meters from where I'm born, actually, right now. And I think it's become, for me personally, a better city. I think even there is a shortage of housing, especially in the places where all people want to live. I think the city offers much more possibilities, and it's more interesting. I'm not sure if all the new architecture is all the buildings, but I think also the mentality of the people. I think especially young people, I work with, even if I not considered all that young anymore, there's a lot of young people working with me, and from my own children, I see they have been living in the center of Oslo for all their life, and I think the city has become more vibrant, more interesting, richer. It's been growing. I am, even if I'm not a huge user of the new parts of Oslo, it's there, and I can, of course, enjoy to have a morning swim, even at this period of the year. So the city has opened up in many ways. I think much of the architecture could be much better. I think the quality of the architecture, it's quite a big concern. I think, especially with huge housing development we have seen, there's a tendency that these buildings become non-architecture in a way. But of course, there is a lot of good example of places and buildings that really embrace the love of what the city should be. So, I mean, there is both good and bad sides within these 2 decades. But all in all, I think Oslo has become a better city to live in. I don't know what the part the Triennale has played in this, but I believe that the consciousness and discussion of the urban development and how actually we discuss how to develop the city, it's very important, and to engage people. I think that the Triennale still has a big challenge to engage more people in the general public, and that is something to, like, the coming editions should have more focus on how you can attract actually big numbers of people. because what we discuss is really concerning each and every one of us, despite if you're architect or not architect. So,
yeah.
Okay.
Great, thank you, Rolf. So Gudmund, I'll ask you to do a short introduction as well.
Yes, hello all. Yes, interesting to hear you, Rolf, because it's, you know, I was president of the Norwegian Association of Architects back in 2003 until 2006, much the same situation as Rolf was describing. It was a period with much discussion about, you know, quality of urban spaces, urban planning and design, quality of architecture, modernism versus traditionalism, and so forth. And also the architect's standing in society was not particularly strong. But at the same time, Oslo was faced with what we might call a paradigm shift from being the harbor city to the fjord city, nested between the blue water and the green forest, between the blue and the green. So the city center was then, you know, when you came down to the Oslo Central Station, the city it ended there. And this expansion towards east and the water was something being discussed. It had been decided to locate the new opera in Bjørvika to act as a locomotive for the expansion of the city eastwards. And there was a large number of urban development projects going on. And the Fjordby plan Fjord City plan was more or less decided on, but it was decided by the city council a couple of years later. So this was the backdrop for the Triennale of 2003. The 2000 Triennale with Rolf was perceived as a great success, you know, something really new and vibrant. And NAL was determined to follow up with the second Triennale. So our main focus was a bit different from the first one, which was maybe I saw it as more sort of theoretical and very visionary, whereas we had the focus to communicate with the general public about the great changes and the improvements that Oslo was facing at the time. To show the public what is actually going to happen. At the same time, we wanted to show, you know, from an architectural NAL perspective, also show to the people in Oslo the importance of the architect's role in, you know, huge processes like this, which I'm a little bit proud of that role, and I think this is something that should be more recognized. That was also very much a part of the backdrop for our Triennale. And also, of course, to try and create a debate with involving politicians, the architects, of course, and also the general public. And there was one more thing that we, you know, with all the things that you could see coming, you could also see that Oslo was going to change dramatically. And also the architecture, I was very convinced, and I still am, that the architecture and the quality of the architecture was going to change the whole image of Oslo. And we thought also this is something that we must try to spread the news also sort of internationally. I called it the Oslo as an architectural capital of Europe. And so these were the main focuses. And when we started our planning, and you know, one of the main points of the exhibition was the Triennale was a huge exhibition down at the harbor, showing all these projects. And we also had a number of events that turned itself to the general public. So we were quite happy that we could count something, don't exactly know the number, but somewhere between 10 and 15,000 people were attending the arrangements that we had. So that's about it for the 2003 Triennale.
Perfect, perfect. Thank you so much. Great introduction. And now I'll ask you, Gary Bates, to say a few words as an introduction for the 2007 Triennale, it was called Culture of Risk.
Correct. Thanks. Yeah, it's almost surprising to be here and see all of you. I didn't know what to expect, but now when I see you, I realize the amount of content that actually has happened in those past 20 years. And I'm happy to have been a part of it. I actually, well, I also would like to be at the dinner that Ralph's at, but I'm glad to be here as an alternative. It's next best. I was part of the original Triennale, so that's where, let's say, the first experience was. I had just arrived in 1999, was part of the 2000. And to say first to that set the kind of precedence that I think was exactly what the Triennale needed. Our project was based on a kind of invisible design for the entire waterfront, and the virtue of that was exactly, I think, what Ralph said, is that it forced people, I think, for weeks after our presentation, people were discussing, because we were blurring the distinction between what was new, what was maybe coming, and what was just projective. And I think that invisibility was our kind of statement in a way to get people to discuss the city again. And I think that, I think it was really successful. So we were happy to be a part of that. In 2006, I was involved in a discussion, and it was an interesting turning point because there was a kind of an impasse. There were different voices, and they invited me into a conversation to discuss, say, how the Triennale could evolve, and that became a kind of tipping point where I fortunately or unfortunately suggested a curator. And the beauty in Norway is then someone just asked me directly, would you like to do it? I said, sure. I invited Alexandra Cruz to join me. And so it was a really interesting, I think, turning point. It stalled. Their intention was this restart. And we, let's say, were able to shift, I think, the Triennale from kind of consensus-driven how to, let's say, get all these different actors on the table to a curator, which creates a different kind of friction, I think, which was important. That becoming an autonomous organization was really, I think, important and had a major influence in things that happened afterwards. On the one hand, the idea of the culture of risk was it was a call for exploring and discussing opportunities that a privileged country like Norway have. I would almost say not just opportunities, but obligations that they could offer the world to give another perspective. So I wanted to kind of open up the entire country and not just Oslo and not just architecture, but to have a kind of broader discussion to look at the openness, the flatness of structure, the equality, the freedoms, the ability and capacity for problem solving that existed in Norway. Now, I was bordering the two sides because I'd lived here now for just a few years, and at the same time had an affinity for the place. And I saw an enormous potential there. So there's a lot of people focused on the risk part. The idea of the culture of risk was this idea coming from the US and this understanding of what is implied in this idea of a culture about risk. The beauty of this kind of seemingly infinite landscape was liberating and distressing. While I think the value set a lot of people admire, I think I saw a kind of risk and stagnation in the endless kind of iterations and what does it mean to be Scandinavian architecture. You know, I can say that my mom, she buys all of her furniture from a store in the United States called Happy Viking. And for her, she feels that's for her traditional Scandinavian design. So there was clearly an enormous brand that was kind of developing where people were discussing it. One could argue, you know, if it was post the 1998 recession, if it was post the things that happened subsequently in the United States, and what it was that kind of generated the Dutch, you could say, had made such a major impact in the 90s. Now we're coming to a point where people are looking for something that's kind of grounded, value-based, and you could see the audience shifting, and the spotlight was increasingly on Norway. And I was at that time concerned that I thought there was a great opportunity. I thought there was so much kind of potential. At the same time, I thought that people might be looking at the wrong thing, and the associations to the Danish modern movement, etc., that we would somehow become, somehow borders would be created. And so part of the idea of risk was to somehow step out of that and give another opportunity. At the same time, as both Goodman and Ralph was saying, that there is a certain kind of question about the impotence of the profession. And I think it is a symptom of this kind of contemporary kind of exacerbation of kind of risk in the profession, from clients to the city officials to politicians to the general public, and the latter obviously being the most important audience when it comes to social equity. And the one that we're ultimately, I think, as architects becoming increasingly detached from. We operate in what one could argue is a largely risk-averse profession, one where there's this kind of exponential anxiety generated by a broad and rather indifferent collaborative platform, ultimately disseminating an agenda of standards. And I think the standardization, and architects were fighting about the rules, architects were fighting about the limitations that were kind of put upon them. But I think it's spread across the full collaboration that is involved in realizing urbanism, planning, and architecture. So I think it's no wonder that in 2020, architecture is a building profession. And I think it's, when I think that all the pressure that was there and the risks that were kind of not taken, back in 2007, we were talking about the environmental situation. We brought up, I think, a lot of issues concerning urbanity, concerning the recreational landscape, concerning brownfield regeneration, concerning the complexity of decentralization and decentralized towns and cities, and what that meant in terms of every city having a concert house and all the infrastructure and the shopping centers, and this new definition of suburbia, you could call it. And it's kind of interesting that now, let's say 13 years later, still architecture remains, despite all of our efforts, one of the biggest kind of polluters on the planet, even though this collective effort to reconcile with the dystopic condition failed. We've taken it on board, but we haven't solved it. So I would say the 2007 Triennial had as its primary ambition to put Norway, its structures, the unique environmental conditions, its engineering accomplishments, and ultimately the ability to fail brilliantly and grow wildly. It was a kind of idea to say, let's look at the entire country and the kind of liberal and low threshold aspect of it to test new ideas, invite young architects, some of which, including Bjarne, are here now. And I think it was just to say, to liberate it from the static relationship of Scandinavian design and look at a discourse beyond the built environment, to discuss social, political, communication, economical, technological. But one thought I want to put on the table before I'm cut off, and hopefully we can discuss it later. A thought that emerged in those conversations with that Triennial in 2007 concerned the relevance of architecture versus the relevance of the architect. And I think those two things can be discussed independently of each other. And maybe we can do that later in the conversation.
Perfect. Thank you, Gary. That was great. Okay. So you're leaving us today, Ulf?
Yeah, I hate to do this, but there's like double things.
Yeah.
Too many things in life.
Yeah, great to have you for a short while. Talk to you soon. Ciao.
Good luck to all of you.
Bye.
And I would
Thank
listen.
you.
Bye then.
Ciao.
Bye.
Ciao.
Nice seeing you.
Okay, so Bjarne, let's move on to you. Do you have a short introduction for the 2000?
Yeah.
Amazing.
To say, we co-participated in the first Triennale, and I still think that was very interesting work, because that Triennale really worked on a thematic level, and we kind of actually addressed important questions, especially due to in Groruddalen, which at that time didn't have any big transformation thoughts. And I think that it really did make some really important sayings and issues that are still valid today in Groruddalen.
Absolutely.
And I'm not sure if we participated in 2003, Goodwin. I don't think we did that, but we did it together with you, Gary, in 2007. And that was also very interesting for me because the risk, I had this idea that if you took the Norwegian oil fund at that time, was it so much money that you could actually slow down the climatic risk that we were facing? And at that moment, at that time, it didn't have enough money, but I combined it with the Canadian oil fund. And then it was actually so much money that you could do. And we had a firm that calculated 10 rules that the world could try to do. I'll give you an example. Slow down the transportation at sea. Did enormous impact on CO2. Well, anyhow, the 2010 Triennale was to have architectural policy on the agenda. And this was decided by the Triennale board. I actually still find the architectural policy very difficult to understand. But, this year in February, Oslo municipality approved their own strategy for architectural policy. And I think that is a kind of a starting point for maybe developing this into something that can have a big meaning in Oslo, like a big search for the identity for city development. In 2010, I was working very close in collaboration with Jannike Hovland, who was the Triennale's general manager at that time. And she did tremendous work. And we actually set out on an exploratory journey together to investigate what architectural politics could contain in 2010. And we had a big desire to have a bottom-up process that should involve a broad professional environment and especially the various architecture and landscape architecture educational institutions in Norway, and bring them together in a way in this quest to kind of fill up this bottom-up bottle with architectural politics. It was titled Man-Made. And it was a very big ambition because we wanted a debate about the role of architecture in governing and leading the development of society, of course with a focus in Oslo. And we also wanted to strengthen the role of the architects. Maybe also a discussion about the physical environment, how it affects the individual and the urban environment, and of course the interaction between them. We also wanted to create an arena that would result in proposal for strategic solutions to make architecture more democratic in facing actually environmental and social changes. And the field needed and still needs a clear geological foundation. It needs knowledge and awareness of what democratic architecture is and can be. And I would also say that maybe later on, this is, I think it's important for us to discuss that in the future. I think that the architectural triennale has to kind of remain up to date on the issues of Oslo, and it must cultivate a kind of a sense of curiosity to explore Oslo's identity. I think that is very important. Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks. We'll just move on to Alejandra. Yep.
I have images, but Cecile, do you have images? Because if I'm the only one, maybe it's better to no images. Okay, so then I will do just an informal talk. Maybe it's better to keep it this way for everybody, so I'm not the only one with images. Well, first I would like to thank Hannah and OAT for organizing this. I'm very happy to be part of, the celebration of your 20th anniversary. It's really nice to, listen to the whole history of, this cultural event, from, framing the institution and defining the institution to appointing specific curators to later to have international competition, right? That in a way depicted different forms of practicing curatorial events or practicing also architecture, right? With collective endeavors. So it's really nice to see the pictures of all of us, on the 7th. It's really nice. And in fact, I'm here to represent my collective or a collective endeavor of a team of 5 scholars, designers, researchers, and curators. I'm going to name them, for the sake of authoring and giving credit to everybody, even though it will take me some seconds because we have long names, but the team was composed by Luis Alexander Casanovas Blanco, Ignacio González Galán, myself, that I'm Alejandra Navarrete Llopis, very pleased to meet you, Carlos Mínguez Carrasco, and Marina Otero García. So we are a team of 5 architects that were selected, as I was saying, through an international competition, and we proposed the topic of After Belonging. So the title of the Triennale that we proposed was called After Belonging, a Triennale in Residence, on Residence, and the ways we stay in transit. And we were looking how architecture can intervene in new forms of identity. How can, material, spatial, and territorial practices can imagine new ways of being together, new ways of forming communities, new ways of forming collectivities. And we were looking at identity not only from that perspective of belonging on the idea of the attachment to places, but also to the level of our relation to the objects that we own, share, produce, and exchange. How do we manage our belongings, right? So we had like those 2 levels of understanding this idea of belonging. And I had to remember that in 2014, there was the migratory crisis in Europe and in the world. So we were looking at the spaces of asylum seeker centers and refugees, refugee camps. We were like studying those case studies, but we were also looking at these questions of identity and belonging from different perspectives. So not only in the people that is forced to move in a particular way, but also to other forms of circulation of objects, for example, with the Amazon infrastructures. So what was the logistics behind the production, delivering, and consumption of all these objects that nowadays we store in our houses, but also to the sharing platforms of Airbnb. How nowadays we can define our homes in a totally different way, right? We arrive to an unknown house and we have the feeling that is part of, or that we belong to that space, right? Even though we are staying there only for 2-3 days. So we were looking at those ideas of different temporalities and different understandings on, or that connection between permanence, identity, belonging, and temporariness at all those different scales. Also understanding questions of tourism as well, right? So different aspects. And the Triennale was also looking at different scales, from the planetary scale, territorial scale, transnational scale, the scales of our homes, and the design of the furniture that was part of our homes. And I think the main ambition of our edition was to expand the formats that the Triennale was asking us. So in the call, we were supposed to present or propose an exhibition, and a catalog. And we presented 6 different platforms in order to, expand the different dialogues that we could foster through that idea of new forms of identity, new forms of belonging. So we did 2 exhibitions, the exhibition on residence and the exhibition in residence in Doga and in the National Museum. But with the exhibition in residence, we selected 10 different sites that we opened for competition for architects to intervene on these sites. And the idea was to expand as well the site of the Triennale. So the Triennale was happening not only in Oslo, but also in different cities around the globe. And in a way, we were trying to establish a dialogue between those complex processes of identity and belonging, or new forms of definition to these questions at different contexts and different sites. And we were really interested on the idea of what is the agency of architects intervening on those sites. So the idea first of expanding the geographies of the Triennale was important, expanding as well the time of the Triennale. So rather than understanding the Triennale that we're going to be open on 2-3 months, we launched the competition a year before. So we already started to have a series of presentations of these sites, a series of conversations from these different teams that were like intervening on these sites. And then another question or another ambition was to expand the different audiences that we were addressing. So not only, through the 2 exhibitions and the book, we were addressing, professionals, but also we had another 2 platforms that opened the conversation to other audiences. One was the academy that we did together with WHO. So we brought more than 10 international universities to Oslo to the opening. So they became not only audience for the conversations that the Triennale was having, but also active agents during 10 days of the opening of the Triennale. So they were also visiting different places in the city and activating the city from their perspective, coming from, like from Venice or from Australia as well. And then another platform that was important also to opening up to very different audiences was the embassy. So by the end of the Triennale, and again, expanding the time of the Triennale, so everything was not only condensed at the beginning or opening, but also at the end, we had another important event bringing people to Oslo, and was this embassy that we built as a temporary installation, temporary embassy in the Oslo City Hall, in the main hall of the City Hall in Oslo. And it was an embassy to represent the communities of the autonomous region of Rojava that were like trying to propose that the questions of democracy were not necessarily connected to the idea of the nation state. And, it was like the Kurdish community of Oslo were there, present in the space, but also the Kurdish community in Rojava was also present through YouTube. So it was a very, very different audience. There were like some architects, but not that many. So it was, a very different type of conversations. The mayor of Oslo opened the floor for the discussions, and we had 2 days with different, cultural agents, activists, and so on, discussing questions of democracy and nation states. For example, like a Sami representative came as well, so it was quite interesting, this idea of bringing politicians, architects, activists to the same table and under the same umbrella. And for us was, as Bjarne was saying before, I think even though the curators have changed and maybe the ambitions or the discussions, I think this idea of having a thematic Triennale for us was quite important, and for all of the 7 editions, right? That we had a specific topic, and then we invited different practices and practitioners to develop their own understanding of this particular topic. So we could foster, we could advance the idea of new forms of belonging.
Great. Thank you, Alejandra. And last but not least, Cecilia, and then we'll try to have a conversation across the table.
Thank you. So I'll just shoot now. I'm the last, so I should just go for it. So yeah, in the spirit of you, Alejandra, let me say, start with saying the group of curators that I represent, which is Maria Smith, Matthew DL, Phineas Harper, and myself, who curated this triennale about the architecture of degrowth. So we were asking the question, how do we build our cities and societies when economic growth is no longer the goal, but human and ecological flourishing matters most? And important here was that this was about enabling change through design, not through collapse, as we like to say. And I think that's particularly important to say now, because today I often hear, in the light of the pandemic, which we can't kind of come around, and you hear people saying all the time, using that as an example for why degrowth is a flawed idea. So, you know, they say, look what happens when we scale down production and consumption, look at the economic crisis that so many people and societies are facing, and so on. But I just want to make clear that this kind of sudden and unplanned and chaotic response to a crisis is not degrowth. Degrowth is a long-term commitment to downscaling consumption and production alongside an intentional and democratic reorganization of society in a more just way. So you can say that COVID-19, on the other hand, has, of course, disproportionately affected the most vulnerable in society. And if anything, I think it has shown why alternative ways of organizing society are needed. And so the kind of, and this is of course in the aftermath, but when we were developing the idea, we were asking, how do such alternatives come about? It seems like the kind of dominant response to address crisis, such as we're now seeing with the pandemic, but also with the climate crisis, it seems to kind of narrow our scope of action by aiming to protect and maintain existing systems rather than changing them. So there is a very kind of strong consensus that we have to change. We have to change radically, but it has to happen within the contours of the existing system so that nothing really have to change. So when we then decided to curate an architecture festival on the theme of degrowth, it was to really highlight the possibilities of radical change in the world and point to how architecture and urban planning and urbanism could lead the way. And so, of course, it's specifically interesting to think about this in the realm of urbanism, for example, as the growth paradigm has been kind of materialized through these urbanization processes, which is characterized by increased privatization, consumption, real estate speculation, and of course, the acceleration of the depletion of the world's resources, which comes from urbanization processes. But then, on the other hand, you also have the fact that the city is the place for possibilities. It's where people mobilize in cities or in streets and squares to kind of demand a change. And for us, it was the central thing with the Triennale was to kind of foreground these possibilities for change. But of course, in order to kind of realize these possibilities, you first have to overcome or break through what makes it impossible. So we thought specifically that the Triennale had a great format in that sense, because it kind of provides the freedom for architects to engage with these changing social, political, and cultural realities beyond the constraints of their day-to-day work, and this way provide a space for architectural thought outside of the domain of the market. So to think maybe more about what kind of architecture society wants and not so much what the market wants. So accordingly, we wanted also the Triennale to expand the ideas of what architecture is and does. And we did this by presenting, and this was also key to engage a broader audience, to present theater performances and immersive artistic interventions rather than the kind of architectural plans and models, in order to position architecture not just as a simple thing to be achieved, but more as also a speculative exercise. You can say a form of spatial agency in order to explore and imagine alternative future spatializations that better encompass ecological and human interests and values. And I think very key here is that these alternatives were not fixed or fully formed solutions, but like society itself, they were an open-ended process. And I think it's exactly this openness is key in order to provide a space for where what is currently thought of as impossible can be expanded. And of course, this should not be mistaken for this idea of just simply celebrating the openness of the future. Instead, I think the Triennale is really a space for experimenting with alternative possibilities and then very concretely study their implications and consequences on the ground. And certainly we've seen that many of the projects that we started developing during the Triennale now actually has further developed and is having a clear impact on architectural practice and urban planning. So for example, the audio walks that we developed with the Triennale is now, we're working with developing that into a digital tool for participation to be used by Norwegian municipalities in planning processes, so here concretely, and also the project Factor of the Future, which I'm writing a lot about, we're writing a lot about in the essay, developed a series of methods for future scenario thinking, which is now taken further by Doga, where they're working with a project called Rural Futures to develop a more inclusive urban development where they bring in young adults in the process through this kind of future scenario thinking. So I would just conclude then by saying that I think the Triennale it is not just in our edition, but I think as we've seen in all the editions, it's really a great platform for creating this kind of empowering arena for exploring a wide range of possible methods or futures or tools or perspectives that in turn really enable other ways of doing things. And that's what I had to say.
Perfect. Okay, so let's try to start a kind of joint conversation. I'm not sure if everyone can see everyone, but I hope so. Okay, cool. So I want to actually start by trying to kind of maybe move forward from a bit what you're talking about, Cecilia, in terms of the Triennale as a platform, and how can it kind of work as a platform. And I want to ask you, Bjarne, after reading your essay and also hearing you talk about the introduction here today, in there, so you kind of puts a lot of focus on that. Now, looking back 10 years, you think that for the Triennale to stay relevant also for the future, it needs to focus more on local issues, but also try to involve builders and kind of developers and contractors in a way into the discussion to actually have an impact. And I just want to ask you, in your opinion, what role do you imagine that OAT could have in the future? Like, what kind of platform would you imagine that OAT should be to be relevant?
Yeah. You know, in my work and Code's work, we are still very aware and very focused on Oslo. And I actually think that straightforward that the Oslo Architecture Triennale, if it is to remain up to date, it must cultivate a sense of curiosity and explore Oslo's identity. And it must at all times be on site and present. Otherwise, it will become irrelevant to the city and turn into an imitation of other international triennales. And I think it must have the courage to address Oslo's in its own terms, and actually dare to ask the city's residents about their real and actual needs. And I think a very good start is to actually invite in private contractors and builders into this format of the Triennale. And of course, it must be done in such a way that they see a self-interest in participating. And I can give you an example, because Code has worked with the real estate company Solon ever since it was founded. And one of the most important processes in this collaboration have actually been a discussion about architecture. And not about square meters and costs, but actually about architecture and how architecture is to have an expression in the situation where the project is to be developed. I mean that this is important, that the Triennale examines places in Oslo, and the goal is to open the discussion and find new and unknown solutions. Code has worked a lot with projects at Jessheim. So a discussion about how the extent of Oslo should be defined is an interesting discussion in itself. I have been asked by residents and politicians at Jessheim, what is the identity of Jessheim? And not easy to answer. Not easy to answer, very difficult, but I think it is a very interesting question for the Triennale. So.
Yeah, and just for your kind of non-local viewers, Jessheim is a community or a place outside of, not so far from Oslo.
Yeah,
close to the airport.
Yeah. But also, at least pre-corona, it was the biggest building site in southern Norway.
Yeah, because as I understand you and also reading your text, I find that you're after that, somehow after that, the Triennale should become more of a practice almost. Like imagining the Triennale actually coming with concrete solutions on how to do architecture. Is that what you're after? Yeah, interesting.
And that's why I think that
so becoming
Reif's Triennale was very good, because it was addressing, I call it thematic, because it was addressing actually the quest for 100,000 new units. And of course, Vinnie Maas didn't understand anything, because he arrived by plane and he was looking down at the city and he could just see one big green landscape, and he said, what the heck is the problem? So but of course what actually that this Triennale did was actually to show that it was quite easy to put in 100,000 new units, because if you just look for new solutions and how to reformulate landscapes or even built landscapes, you can find these solutions. But I'm very positive, Hanna, and I think that the Triennale is relevant because it's in its best version, it can offer an expressive vision of vision we otherwise wouldn't have. It will always be this X factor. And the advantage of the format is that it can be highly relevant and you can focus on a specific area, and only to disintegrate afterwards. So you don't have to be afraid of kind of putting forward wrong solutions or being provocative or But of course, I mean it, we have to be honest. And I think that the Triennale should focus more on the profession. It has to be for the profession, and it has to be an interdisciplinary structure, solid rooted in architecture and urbanism. And it must be about Oslo's identity. And it must absorb the needs of the city's inhabitants. So I wanted to be very strictly on this professional, but of course, communication terms. There be this arena of different inputs.
Yeah. No, I think it's interesting because I'm after this kind of idea of the the Triennale and what it can actually be. And I want to ask you, Alejandra, as a kind of to react a bit to what Bjarne is saying, because in the essay you write, and I can quote, the Triennale has the potential to become a catalyzer for certain practices whose work may not find its place in the construction market, but whose ideas are relevant to advance architecture discourse, and kind of the Triennale as a space for giving voice to practices that would never enter into an architecture discussion if it would be through actually practicing architecture. So what are your thoughts on what Bjarne is kind of suggesting in a way?
No, totally. I was thinking that for me, this type of cultural events can stay relevant if, of course, we include, the expertise on spatial and technological knowledge that our discipline has, but we always we connect this knowledge and this disciplinary arena with the cultural, social, and political aspects of the transformation of the society. Because I do think that architecture is a cultural practice, is a social practice, and is a political practice, with specific means and tools, of course, of buildings as an element of definition of our discipline. But in a way, we are generating spaces, discourses, and ideas for people to inhabit and people to live together. So we cannot, in a way, remove from the equation of our discipline these different aspects. So I do think for me to stay relevant would be to always be grounded on the social transformations that are happening nowadays in our society. For me, that's key. And another thing is that maybe we don't need to dissociate, the construction or private market from other type of practices. So maybe it's not one or the other. I understand that sometimes we need to choose our battles. So we don't have the means to include everybody, and there's no such a thing as, full inclusivity, I guess, on when you have a specific space, a specific budget, and so on. But I do think on the dialogue between practices that are more speculative or utopian or more connected to intellectual endeavors could be in dialogue with practices that are more connected to, the technological advancements of the brick, and maybe precisely on those dialogues we can advance new ways of, imagining better futures. So I do think it's better not to exclude. So I think it's better to, connect and establish dialogues. And at least that's what we were trying, and at least that's my and our understanding of architecture, as a cultural practice and an intellectual endeavor.
Yeah. Any more comments on that from anyone? Yeah, Gary has something on his mind.
No, I think Oslo is incredibly important, and I think in a certain way, at the same time, you can choose any place and give it relevance. It helps that it's Oslo for those of us that are here in Oslo, but I think one of the things that we tried to do in terms of looking at all of Norway, if I can give you an example, is that, recently we've been visiting Svalbard in the north, and it's an incredibly potent area. If only for the geopolitical things that are playing out there that most people in the world don't know anything about, but it's somehow under administration of Norway, where the shipping lines will open up and the entire way that the world will relate to trading and movement will be radically different in the future. It's incredibly potent. At the same time, you have tourism, you have how to negotiate tourism in this recreational landscape with an educational component, and how do you actually address that? And again, it's a kind of area that there's so many things, even just in terms of construction. There are no building materials there. There are 3,000 people that live there. How do you use that intelligence that you would get and be able to take that into other areas, like areas where you have incredible immigration and temporary structures and things? And so how do you, that's what I meant to say, to put Norway out on, let's say, to kind of completely open it up, or as a kind of, and look at it with all the things that it offers, whether it's the offshore industry that has created kind of structures that architecture could generally only dream about, and the amount of research that goes into that. If you just take research as a starting point, in general, architects are, I mean, unless you're a researcher, and thank you, Cecilia. I wish I was a researcher, and I wish it was really a pleasure to listen to you talk, because that's exactly how I would like to kind of run an architectural practice, let's say, and to have that kind of ballast behind it. But if you take research, I mean, generally, we as architects, no one's paying us to do it. We do it because it has to be done. We come in far too late in the process. And so I think to keep it, as you say, as a kind of intellectual discourse, to be able to use, I think every condition, almost every condition that you could want to talk, whether it's immigration, whether it's the geopolitical, whether it's environmental dystopia, whether it's tourism, the recreational landscape, new forms of construction in difficult environments. There's so many things that are coming out of Norway that you could use. And that's what I'm saying, is that we have the ability to kind of disseminate that information to a much larger audience than just here. And I think as a testing ground, it's amazing. And I think it'll change radically, even when you start to look at what happens when sovereignty ends, what happens when we come to a borderless society, what happens when immigration kind of, when immigration changes and borders, you know, which many of us would say is an inevitability if you want to abolish poverty and have universal income and things like that. And architecture, I think, plays into all of those, or architects, I want to say, rather than architecture, because and that's what I tried to say before. And that's what I also, again, Cecilia, liked, is that you didn't use the word architecture or architects, you just said spatial agency. I really appreciate that, thank you. So I think it's an intellectual practice. I think it's interesting. And I think actually one thing I wanted to throw back, even though that's not the question now, is that just as in 2007 we changed and made it a curated based platform, I think in 2020 maybe Oslo falls out of the word architectural triennial and maybe it becomes the Norwegian architectural triennial. That would be my suggestion.
Yeah. Gudmund, your approach to the edition that you did were very much kind of down to earth in a way, and you choose to somehow show best practice, which is maybe a more kind of traditional way of discussing architecture, showing projects that either are planned or has been planned or built. Looking kind of from 2003 and what you did with the Triennale then and your ambition for the Triennale and what kind of platform that would be, how are you kind of during this discussion here today, what are your reactions on how the Triennale developed in a way?
I like your description, down to earth, because that's absolutely what it is. Probably just as I am also very down to earth architect. I enjoy these themes that have been sort of shown quite a lot in the later triennales, and I think it's been very good. But they are, many of them, very narrow for addressing academics and intellectuals and architectural practices that have focused more on the theory than the practice, maybe. This is not entirely true, of course, but it's interesting. And I'm just looking, for example, degrowth with the home planet, lek og lytting, Fremtidsfabrikken, which are all, I think, very interesting elements in the Triennale. And at the same time, they have a very narrow appeal. And I think they also would be, many of these examples are essential for the quality and the sort of width of the Triennale. So I think absolutely they should be integral part of the Triennale, that sort of thinking. But I still think there is room for more. You know, you don't have to be very narrow, very intellectual only. You can be that and also be down to earth, as it were. So this is really what I feel. I would like to you know, look at who is the target. We mentioned academics, intellectuals, and architects. Bjarne, you mentioned architects and architecture, also very important, obviously. Politicians, but not least, you know, the general public, I think is a very, you know, it's our target too. And I really believe that the more people that understand architecture, take an interest in architecture, take an interest in discussing architecture and urban developments, urban life, the better chance there is for the quality of our built environment to be better. And also to give architects better possibilities to do good planning, do good design, do good architecture. So I feel that, you know, 20 years experience, how do we go further? I think we should focus on a wider audience. I call, you know, you call it architectural festival in your webpage, Hanna, which I think is good and absolutely in my thinking. But the festival is something also that includes, you know, the more the better. So I think that's interesting. I think also it is a golden opportunity for addressing and connecting with the international environment, especially within architecture, planning, and design. And personally, I feel that what has happened over the last 20 odd years has really enhanced Oslo as a city with its diversity, the architecture, the way we meet the water, all this, and all the iconic buildings that we also are getting. So I feel there's a lot of, from architects, there will be a lot of interest in what is happening in Oslo, and which also could be an integral part of the Triennale. So summing up, you know, continue with the narrowness, but widen it at the same time. That's what I would like.
Yeah, Cecilia has a comment.
Just to say that if it becomes too narrow, it also becomes very nearsighted, and you lose a lot of interest.
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting that you, when you were referring to the G-Growth Triennale, that it was narrow, because exactly the project that you're referring to, it's very interesting. The Factor of the Future was actually the first layer of participants were all the locals in Grönland. So we had a lot of contact. We were walking actually with the community organizations in Grönland, including the local population there. And the point was that we were in Grönland. We didn't invite them to the Triennale because we knew that Triennale was already kind of a threshold to come into the place where we did the Triennale. So with Factor of the Future, we started out with the local population in Grönland, and then we actually invited both construction workers and builders and architects and into a second workshop where they were part of making these future scenarios. So we were actually working on all these layers, but the thing is, some audience groups may not be able to enter the venues of the Triennale the way they are today. So they have to be met where they are. And that was what we did a lot with our edition of the Triennale, was to meet the audience where they were. And that was also the case with the audio walks that we developed. So we made them with local populations all around Oslo, and particularly school kids. So now we developed a platform for disseminating architecture to all the 5th graders in Oslo that will have been going to this audio walk to learn about architecture and what it means for the city. And that's actually now becoming a national project in Norway, where all the school children are going to do this kind of walk. So I think it's also about seeing where do you meet the audiences, and is kind of like, I think there also the challenge with the architectural exhibition is that it often creates a threshold exactly for other people that feel like this is very abstract to them, or the model is very, you know, like they can't, the way that the laymen relate to architecture is very embodied. It's our embodied response to our environment. And then meeting a model, for example, in an exhibition is quite a different experience, and it requires a different kind of intellectual labor for you to understand. And so I believe, and I really believe in this idea of also expanding from the architectural exhibition to have more immersive experiences, which involves also like walks, audio walks out in the architecture, to be there, to respond to it that way, and to, as an audience who doesn't know architecture in the abstract sense, but in the embodied sense, to get that experience and can relate to it in that way. So
I think what you're saying is absolutely true. At the same time, of course, it would be, that's one way, and there are a number of ways of reaching out to the population. So you know, to find the formula there, obviously, is not easy.
And I think also, if I can add to that, I think like a lot of the, at least in the last 5 or 6 years when I worked with the Triennale, a lot of the projects that we do are long-term projects. A lot of them live on even after the Triennale, and I think that some of them are also a bit invisible for the people who were not part of them anyway, or who are not deeply involved, but that doesn't mean that they're not influential through the people that actually meet them. But I do think that there's definitely like layers of the Triennale that are visible to some people and are attractive and relevant to them, and then there's other layers of the Triennale that might be more visible to the traditional architect, like kind of the practicing office, or where an exhibition like yours that you put up, Gudmund, or maybe in 2000, where you invited architects to actually come with concrete examples of how to, which I think is super interesting, how to develop Oslo. And they were visible to a different audience in a way. But yeah, Bjarne, you kind of raised your hand, you had something.
Yeah, just how to unmute. I'm not very glad for this, that the Triennale is turning into kind of a broad festival. I mean, of course it can be fun or something like this, and it can be reaching out, but I think it is important to understand that Oslo is a European capital, which is very special because it's small, it's by the fjord, it's by the mountain, it has nature close to the city center. And you had this question where we were saying, what role can OAT assume in connecting the local and international discourses? And I think that the easy answer is like Björvika. Okay, you import kind of international style or trends or whatever, but we could also say by examining local context and Oslo's identity, one can perhaps uncover international, relevant and interesting projects. And they're interesting because the architecture of the project is locally motivated. And I'm talking about how it looks, how the architecture is expressing itself, and the identity of the people surrounding it and using it. And of course also that it is based on environmental clear thoughts in the local climatic situation. So I think it's a very, I'm not, of course, against that the Triennale will broaden up and do a lot of stuff that can be, you know, containing art and music and all this. It's fine, but still, I think it's important for me, at least, to just say to the panel that I think we still have big possibilities in our profession to actually clarify and make architecture, and especially residential areas and residential buildings and outdoor spaces a lot better, like Raoul was saying, that he was a critic of a lot of what is going on now. Yeah,
do you think that, yeah, no, I want to follow up on that, because do you think that that is the role of the Triennale, to kind of bring forward those examples of better residential housing, for example? Or do you think that's to the kind of task of the profession?
No, I think that is actually the role of the Triennale. Or
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, and I think also the Triennale could also discuss make the Fjordbyen more accessible.
Yeah.
Make the Fjordbyen bigger with recreational areas. It's a very political discussion.
I know,
And I just wanted to say that, I think that maybe the Triennale should take a critical look at the Byantikvarens yellow list, because it's very big and long, and it could be a way to find new plots, even new areas for densification.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Yeah, you're looking upon the Triennale more as an architectural office.
Yeah.
Doing architecture work in a way. Yeah. Gudmund, what's your thoughts?
Yes, it's interesting because, of course, when I was in the Triennale, and my point of departure was the architectural profession, NIL, and I've always looked at the Triennale as a kind of an extension of the architect's sort of activity, and also a way of profiling architects and architecture in society. I don't look at this as architectural practice or office, but I think it's definitely very much a part of the architect's identity. It should be. And there should be, if you have 5,000 architects in Norway, there should be 5,000 of them being owners of the Triennale. But I had also taken note before the meeting that, like, one theme that I think would be interesting for a Triennale is how the residential, housing is being developed. If you look at the last 10, 15 years of residential development, it's enormous. And to me, the quality of it is, in very many cases, or most cases almost, really not up to standard. I'm thinking of qualities of living, outdoor space, some play areas for kids, and the quality of the actual dwellings, not to speak of materials and details and architectural expression. This is, I think it's quite an important theme.
Yeah.
And it's a political theme, but by addressing it in the sense that a Triennale could do, I think it could be a voice heard, and which could have impact on the ways of thinking, because it's with the politics in all privatization, more and more left to people that have only one motive when they build, and that is to earn money.
Yeah.
Different from how it was with when Ovos and all these had a sort of social, when Ovos had a social sort of standing or idea behind the work.
Yeah, I'm going to let Gary in just a second. I just want to make one comment, and maybe we can get back to that later about the architect, because you're saying that the Triennale somehow should be representing the identity of the architect, and there's 5,000 of them in Oslo, and I think that brings us into, okay, so what is an architect, and who does? So do you look at them as like homogenic group, or could that is not just one thing in my mind, but then
no, it's absolutely not a homogenic.
Yeah. But yeah, I want to let Gary into the conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. No, I first of all, I think it's it's kind of ironic. There used to be a time when the architect had something which was called asymmetric knowledge. Asymmetric knowledge is, for example, when I go to my doctor, I walk in the door, I say, I have a pain in my shoulder, I want you to operate, I want to do it tomorrow, and I want it to cost this much money. And if I say that to a doctor, of course, he would laugh and kick me out of his office and tell me, this is how we're going to do it, and this is the process, and this is how long it'll take, and this is how much rehabilitation it'll take, etc. Because exactly he has asymmetric knowledge. Now, architects at some point also had that, but I think have largely kind of forfeited that in the profession. And I think that's also in part to what Goodman says, why the quality that we see is kind of radically diminishing. Now, I find it a kind of interesting, almost split in the panel here between, let's say, let's focus on architecture, and actually I don't think that split needs to exist. I don't think there is genuinely a split between the intellectual pursuit and say almost the Triennale more as a kind of postgraduate program, which is even helping, because as an architect myself practicing, the intellectual input that you get during the daytime in the meetings with clients, maybe with the exception of Saloon, is incredibly limited. And the Triennale is giving another voice and another perspective. And I definitely don't think, you know, an intellectual pursuit is something like a roux when you're cooking. You distill it, but that just becomes the base for how you can then disseminate this information on many different platforms in many different ways to many different audiences. And I think that's what's so incredibly important, and the potential of the Triennale. And I think it's really, you know, it's easy to talk about architecture, and I think, you know, ironically enough, they're talking already about getting rid of the architect as a protected title, because we don't have that asymmetric knowledge, because contractors feel that they can do it, because Plan and Bygningsetat is basically operating like its own architectural practice already. And if the Triennale also does that, and maybe AHO will also become its own architectural practice, basically everyone can be a freaking architect at that moment. And I think there is still a unique knowledge that the architect has, and that's why I try to make a separation between architecture and the architect, because I think the type of education we have, the ability that we have to kind of consolidate a lot of different types of information and bring them together and bring them to many different types of audiences is still kind of unique and asymmetric to what other people can do. And so I think the architect is an incredibly valuable profession.
Yeah, I think Andrea was next,
Yeah.
and then Cecilia.
I wanted to respond to Bjarne, but also what you were saying, Hannah, about, you know, there is such a thing as Norwegian architecture as a singular and single way of responding to spatial practices? I'm not so sure about it. You know, and precisely with the Triennale that we did in 2016, we were trying to question that idea, you know, that, or moving beyond identity politics, or using identity as a way of like framing society connected to, you know, the definition of the territory through the national boundaries, the nation state, or the family, you know, so really trying to question those ideas. For example, in our Triennale, we were having local voices that were proposing a very different understanding of architecture. So for example, Grobonesmo was part of the discussion of the international conference, and Space Group has a totally different architecture than TIN. Next to you exactly, and they are all based in Oslo, both of them, you know, but they have a different understanding on how to practice architecture. Or Carl Otto Ellefsen, that was part of the discussion as well. So we had a lot of local practices that have very different aesthetics responses to architecture. So I don't think we can have such a or a singular vision of this question. I think it's much more complex than that. What does it mean to be Norwegian nowadays? Is only people who has been there for 5 years, or is people who has been born in Norway? You know, so there are a lot of like levels of belonging and identity, and a lot of like different diverse responses. Another thing connected to what Cecilia was saying, one of our sites was also located in Oslo. It was an asylum seeker center on the outskirts of the city. And we had local architects, Eriksen Eskaya. Now they have formed two different offices. They were like intervening on this site. And then we have two different groups, one from Bergen and one from Belgium. And they were, again, having a discussion, a pan-European discussion, let's say, or transnational discussion on how to see or how to respond to these complex questions. So I do think the Triennale is a space to precisely question these understandings of architecture.
post them to everyone? Because I think there are only for panelists.
Yes, Cecilia, you had a comment as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to say this regarding this idea of the Triennale presenting solutions. So what I'd like to think about the Triennale as rather widening the scope of action, which I think is really important. So say, Gudmund, you suggested that if we would talk about the living qualities in Oslo as a theme, which I think is great, and I think it's really important to talk about that. But then what the Triennale could do, because if you work about housing in Oslo, it's a very contentious issue. Emotions run high. It's a so-called hot setting where often people are really speaking very emotionally to get their thoughts across, and it's very hard to experiment with other ideas or perspective on an issue when it's so hot setting. And what the Triennale can do is to provide a more cool, deliberative setting where you can discuss these things without so much on stake, but rather experiment with how. So then, for example, say, okay, if we don't talk about housing, what if we talk about just the home? Because the word home is actually missing from a lot of these discussions. So what happens if we talk about home instead of housing in these discussions? And then the Triennale can kind of go from there. And I'm sure there will come a lot of possible solutions and ideas out of that, which would not necessarily have happened in a very hot office setting when you have to find a solution for a particular problem. So I think this idea of broadening the scope of how we address issues and broadening our perspectives is just central, particularly today when things are getting so productive and effective in the way that there's no room for reflection in the same way anymore.
Any comments to that? Yeah, Gary Bates, that's a good comment. Yeah, no, I want to maybe move on to or bring us into a discussion on these, because I think also the Triennale has, as it is functioning today in many ways, it's balancing in kind of in between a lot of roles. And on one side, it should kind of challenge the profession in a way, and should be someone provoking new ideas and thoughts within the practicing kind of a community of architects. And on the other hand, it should, like what you're talking about now, Cecilia, kind of meet the audience in a much wider sense, and possibly also not on our own arena, but rather being out there, going to meet the audience rather than asking them to come to us. And then the third leg is the international one. And I want to ask you, maybe Alejandra, and maybe not so much about your work you did in 2016, but rather being on the one here today that's not kind of an Oslonian in a way, and not having Norway as your home base. What is the kind of idea of the Triennale from the outside? And when you decided to answer the call, so what I'm asking is maybe what role can the Triennale play on an international level?
Well, one thing that I think is very important on this type of cultural events is that you have an international open call for curators. And this is not very usual in other cultural events. So for us was key. And I think if you keep this model, I do think you will have a lot of responses from elsewhere, not only from curators and architects from Oslo, but also from elsewhere, no? As it happened to us. We didn't have that many opportunities to present our ideas to curate a Triennale, or a Biennale or an exhibition. So I think keeping that model is quite interesting. So that's one of the aspects that made us apply to this. Also the previous Triennale, the Rotor Triennale was quite as well. It was the first one responding or launching an international call. So it started to build on this idea that building connections between the local context of Norway and the international context, right? You had this set of curators from Belgium, and they started to look at sustainable practices on a very interesting way. So it was the first time that we heard about OAT, in the edition of 2013, and then we decided to apply in 2014. So I think that that's a way of keeping, your agency or your voice out there, really opening the space of topics to everybody, and I think that's quite interesting for us. And I mean, for us, it was quite fluid, the relationship between us being outsiders with you, OAT. You were precisely you were that bridge between your partner institutions and us that were coming from outside. Of course, we had some knowledge about this context, but you were precisely feeding us and connecting us, with NAL, with the National Museum of Architecture, with WHO, with all the different ages, and then they had their own constituencies and their own audience. So I think you, as this cultural institution, precisely can bridge that international audience with the local audience through those partner institutions that you have. And for us, it was, as I was saying, it was quite natural and fluid with you in the middle, facilitating those dialogues. Another thing that helped us a lot as well was in this idea that you were like connecting us with people was also the political dialogue that you established. So the Prime Minister came to one of the events and the Mayor of Oslo opened another event of the closing of the Triennale. So that was also something quite shocking for us, that you could establish those dialogues. No, I mean, it's not that easy. In other contexts, it's not that easy to really engage politicians in architectural events. So I think that was quite important for us, and this idea of broadening or understanding architecture as a cultural practice and bringing people from elsewhere, this idea of bringing politicians as well, or including the politician's voice, is quite important. And then politicians are responsible for, defining regulations as well. So we can also shape their discourses and the future regulations through these dialogues that we're establishing with them. So for us, those two aspects were quite important. That connection.
I think coming from the outside is having voices and kind of views from the outside on what's going on in Oslo, and then problematizing that. I think it's a very important issue. But then on this kind of the other side of that coin is that it's really, really difficult to problematize something you don't really know, that you somehow need to know from the inside to actually understand how to ask questions about it, which is a very local thing, which means you have to maybe been living in the city for a long time to kind of understand. So I think it's also like a dilemma of being international and being local. Kind of at the same time. But yeah, Gary.
But I think sorry, just one more thing.
Yeah.
It depends on your approach. Yeah. So of course we were coming from abroad, but we had your knowledge, and then we were doing site visits. For example, I remember like visiting the Asylum Seeker Center and having interviews with the NGO managing this center. So there is a space for taking care of situated practices as situated spaces. So I don't think if you come from abroad, then you don't have any knowledge or any way of intervening on a site. Precisely is your point of view and your approach that is respectful, of course, with the local entities, local actors, and local conditions that can bring or establish different dialogues. So we were very careful on that as well.
Yeah, Gary.
No, I mean, I think that's what I said in my introduction. There is a unique situation here in the flatness of the European structure that you can actually walk up to the mayor, which I recently did, and have a conversation. And there are very few places in the world, let's say very few countries you can do that. I think that, it's a really unique condition. And I think the Triennale has so far taken advantage of that. In our, let's say, while we focused, let's say, on many different conditions in Norway, which I outlined before, but when we had the actual conference discussion, there was sociologist, social anthropologist, there was an economist, there was a technologist, there was a communication expert from New York, from 2x4. there was a filmmaker, Hans-Petter Mouland was there. And I think the beauty of that is what I was referring to before is how the architect can regain this kind of asymmetric knowledge, this asymmetric position, because ultimately it's the architect then that kind of disseminates it and kind of pushes it back into these 5 rooms. I mean, we're all talking indirectly about these 5 rooms. And I think you can bring them all together, being the client, the public, the planning authorities, the politics, the academics. And I think when you have all of those kind of components, that's where the architect is really unique in curating that. And I think you as an organization can empower us. I mean, just put it another way. I work in the same city as Bjarne and Goodman, and this is the first conversation we've had in probably 10 years. Okay, Goodman and I had a coffee maybe a year ago, but besides that, we don't discuss, we don't meet. There is no critical platform. It's not at the university. We're not meeting for lectures. We're doing our buildings and our practices, etc. We never meet, ever. And in general, even when we do meet, there's a very that's, you could say, the downside of Norway, which you guys could resist, is that there is a really averse, an environment that's averse to critique, whereas, I come from an environment that is kind of all about explosive critique. This is an environment that's averse to critique. So we don't meet, and if we do, we are fucking polite. And I think you guys have a kind of unique opportunity because you don't have to be polite. When you bring in other people, they're going to bring an enormous amount of discomfort as well. And they're going to ask really uncomfortable questions as well. And I think you guys have managed to curate that in a kind of interesting way. I could easily now take notes from everything that everyone said in their introductions, and you'll see that there is really a lot of connections in between what we're trying to say. There might be different approaches and ways to achieve it. I think that's actually kind of unique in this discussion. But if you can continue to empower us, and we can take that and bring it back to what we do every day, that's where I think it's such a unique thing. And that's why I compared it not to an architectural office at all, but to, for instance, something that's more like almost a postgraduate discourse, because I think it's empowering. It empowered me. It empowers the work that we do. Like you said, Alejandro, I think it's really great to have that breadth and to have that international perspective and to have this incredible testing ground. And whether that's, and you can define that testing ground as you will.
Yeah, Goodman, did you have a...
No, I agree with what Gary is saying, because, the operative word, I bring it all together. It's not a split. I think that, what I'm trying to convey is that I think, the narrowness of the triennial should be maintained and kept and enhanced and developed. But there is if you do a full circle, it only fills part of the circle or the cake, and you can increase that by very interesting and very important issues that have a wider audience and a wider wider impact. That's the main point I'm trying to make.
Yeah, no, and I think what Gary's saying that, okay, so you, Bjarne and Goodman and Gary, you all work in Oslo, but like this is the first time in a long time that you've kind of spoken together about these issues, and I think that the Triennale should maybe be even better at being that place for meetings and kind of loud and possibly complex and difficult discussions, but they should still be going on, and then somehow the Triennale's job is to interpret these discussions and complex issues to actually disseminate to an audience through programs and projects, and if it's exhibitions or sound walks or theater plays, but somehow be that interpreter of what's going on inside the field and how that can be or is relevant for people outside the field in a way. Yeah. Okay, I think that on my end, I have like 100 more questions on these 2 pages here, but I think that it's time to kind of round up, and I want to say a huge thank you to all of you, and also the Reiulf, who's not here, and also Rutor, who wrote put your kind of effort into writing these essays, and they would be standing as kind of a testimony to 20 years of work and interest and kind of engagement in the field of architecture. And I think the question about the architecture relevance in the future, and also the architect relevance, because I do think these are two different discussions in many ways, should just be continued. And yeah, I don't know if anyone of you has, there was a few comments in the chat, but there was more comments rather than questions. So we kind of left them as comments in the chat field. But is there any last remarks? Yeah, please.
One thing I just really want to stress, and it's nothing that we talked about at all, but something that's really important to me and to a few other people that I'm close to, and that is the diversity in the profession and the diversity in this discussion. And it's something that we've kind of talked about, and obviously, not obviously, but from my perspective, in terms of, let's say, Black architects and who I have a kind of connection to, kind of Kunle Adeyemi and Kere, Francois Kere, and of course David Jayat. So there are, let's say, but I think it's important for you to have in the back of your mind that kind of diversity, and that is obviously let's say, from the gender gap to I think minorities, and I think also when we consider the incredible impact that immigration will continue to have in Europe is also incredibly important. And I think there are some really big issues that we still need to kind of think about, and that will be influential for us as architects when we have that asymmetric knowledge to deal with and to be able to handle when it comes. And one thing I want to reiterate, which I said earlier and maybe too lightly, is that we've been bragging about our intelligence in terms of dealing with the environmental dystopia that we're kind of confronted with, but realistically, we've done far too little. Far too little. And I think we're just scratching the surface. And I think that's one of the problems about how slow the profession is compared to other industries. So I just wanted to say those three things. Sorry.
Great. And Cecilia?
Can I just reiterate that? And I think, yeah, particularly the diversity and also the climate crisis, we cannot talk beside it. And it shows us that more than ever, we need an experimental platform where we can think differently about these issues, because we cannot be stuck in the same way of doing things that has led us here. So we need these places where we think differently about how to address such utterly important issues.
Good point.
I cannot agree more with both of you. And in fact, I've been thinking with your questions, Hannah, that I think OAT can recenter the structures of power, looking at what has been in the periphery of the discipline and really bringing it to the center and question what is, normative discourses, normative architecture. And really what Kerry was saying, I do think it is important to connect all these inequalities or all these forms of oppression. So they cannot inhabit isolated bubbles, but looking at intersectionality as a way of connecting all these questions, from environmental justice to social justice to gender equity and racial equity, of course. So all those things are connected. So I think OAT can be that platform of connecting those things that maybe in the disciplinary or in the practice of our daily lives are not that easy, to connect. Or not that easy to unfold and to unveil those connections,
Yeah. Anyone else? Bjarne, did you have anything?
Yeah, I was.
But it was more like a goodbye.
No, I was just like to comment on the very fine words from Gary. I absolutely agree that we have to make integration and a big topic also in the urban space. More use it as a social arena in a way, but still, of course, for the Triennale, I think it's, for me at least, it's important to keep it simple in a way. I want the Triennale to be an eye-opener for opportunities in urban development and new interesting architecture for private developers, for public decision makers, and of course the people in Oslo.
Yeah.
I think it's important. It has to have this strength, be this eye-opener, one way or another. Oh well, thank you for being.
Just I want to say one last thing that I forgot because I made a note to myself. Stay light on your feet. Like if you could stay light on your feet, meaning that when there's a natural disaster, that you guys can be able to empower people to have a discourse. I think it's super important to have people like you there, Anna, and stay light on your feet. And another thing, OAT has to have a 0 footprint.
Yeah.
Then
we need to continue having these digital dialogues, I think. No, but I agree with you, Gary, and thanks for kind of putting that on the table, because it's an important challenge, and these kind of events around the globe, people traveling from all over, ending on kind of a negative note. It's a very important issue as well. Can we afford actually doing that, bringing people together from all over the world like that, and then producing exhibitions, throwing in them out for what and for how long? And so what we do invest in needs to have permanent kind of footprints that are not negative in terms of CO2, but positive in terms of the impact that they do have on people's lives and the kind of development of the profession.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much. I hope to see you all very soon in a different, more physical setting. And I also want to say to those of you watching from home that there's another conversation on Friday, which is tomorrow, with Mies TV, who has produced a short film series for the Jubilee. And the Jubilee platform is still ticking with new information every day, and we'll keep doing so until Sunday. And then all the events that are going on will also be available afterwards. So the Jubilee platform is already some kind of an archive of all these discussions. So enjoy that in the time when that's best for you. Okay.
Thank you so much for the
Thank you,
invitation.
everyone.
Very pleased to meet you all.
Nice.
Conversation.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.